We're of course in the midst of the Steam summer sale, but I thought today let's do something a little bit different. Instead of just going through the main highlights for today from the front page and more, I thought let's focus it down a little bit and give you 7 games in the Steam sale that are like Dark Souls. Because of course Dark Souls itself is in the Steam sale, but you know, maybe like me you've played a lot, far too much of Dark Souls, but you're after something similar, something to give you the feeling of getting good, as it were. My name is Marta, and in this Red Gaming Tech video I'm going to give you 7 recommendations of games like Dark Souls in the Steam Summer Sale 2017. And I'm going to start off with some ones that you've probably heard of, as they have been either in the news lately or they're fairly popular. The first one I want to start off with is probably the most obvious, in the form of Salt and Sanctuary. This has been pretty much described, and rightfully so, as Dark Souls but 2D. It is Dark Souls pretty much to a T. It's not just copying it or whatever. It has that same sort of atmosphere, has the same sort of slow, methodical combat. It has that same sort of punishing level of difficulty, but at the same time being fair. You know, one of the things that makes Dark Souls so popular is it's not just difficult because it's difficult. You know, we've had difficult games many times. You know, all the games that you and I grew up with were actually difficult to the point of unfairness. They were unfair and difficult, and they were difficult because they were unfair. Whereas Dark Souls is definitely punishing and definitely difficult, but definitely fair. And I think Salt and Sanctuary has that. You know, it has the sort of gloomy, dark atmosphere, same sense of exploration. If you like Dark Souls, you can't really go wrong with this one. Obviously, it's a bit more basic graphics-wise, and obviously it is a side-scroller rather than a 3D game like Dark Souls, but it's 40% off, making it £8.15. Next up is a game that's actually in early access, but I still feel like it's worth a mention. It is, of course, none other than Dead Cells. Even though this game is in early access, it is pretty damn awesome, and it's not one of those early access games where it barely works, it's lacking any real content. This game is fairly complete. Obviously it's not complete, but essentially it's just kind of adding more content, you know, obviously polishing off some stuff, listening to player feedback, just finishing off the game, as it were. But what is there is a definitely solid package, and it is currently 15% off, making it £11.89. Now this definitely has some roguelite elements of it, which may put some people off, but it is also a really strong Metroidvania game. But I feel like it definitely keeps the spirit of Dark Souls. You know, the combat is definitely faster paced than it is in Dark Souls. It's less deliberate. You think about each move less, because obviously in Dark Souls you've got the whole thing of working out, okay, I've only got X amount of stamina, so I should back off and lower my shield, but obviously that will put me at risk of being hit. But you know, if I get without stamina, that could be really bad. And you know, managing your attacks and learning attack patterns, that sort of thing. All of that is very slow and deliberate in Dark Souls. And Dead Cells, you know, you definitely want to think about what you're doing. You don't want to just mash the buttons and hope for the best. But it is definitely faster paced, and you definitely face, I would say, more enemies per room than you would in an average Dark Souls room. And obviously it has a very different aesthetic as well. The graphics are quite striking and quite beautiful as well. So if you're prepared to take some roguelite elements being mixed in with your Dark Souls, I definitely recommend Dead Cells. It is very strong, and again, for an early access game, it is very good. This is definitely one of the games that exemplifies the good parts of early access. Next game on our offering is Hyperlight Drifter. Another game with a very unique and interesting aesthetic, obviously more of a pixel art style, but that doesn't stop the game from looking absolutely stunning and really colourful. So obviously definitely a juxtapose there to Dark Souls, which, while it is a beautiful game, can often be dark and dingy and terrifying, well, because that's kind of the point. This game is obviously definitely the opposite of that, but it has a lot of key elements I think are more important than appearances. You're exploring ruined worlds, taking part in very hectic, difficult combat. You know, the game holds no punches back, as they say. And I think it has the same sort of sense of mystery and exploration as Dark Souls. You know, obviously we've all played Dark Souls many times now, at least most of us has, I would say. I say all, but, you know, obviously some people haven't, but you get my meaning. But, you know, when you first played the game, there's always that sense of, like, having your shield up always, and just, like, what is going to be around this next corner. And you might come across an enemy that tries to horribly murder you, or a really beautiful area that just is begging to be explored. And I feel it's that, plus the difficulty that Hyperlight Drifter definitely captures, especially now that it runs at 60 FPS. It is 50% off, making it $7.49, so a fairly inexpensive purchase. But let's move on to something a little more recent for our next entry with The Surge. Now this is by the guys over at Deck 13, who of course have tried their hand at a Dark Souls-like game before in the form of Lords of the Fallen. Obviously that game was kind of meh, as we discovered at the time, but The Surge is definitely an improvement. It doesn't quite manage to capture the majesty of Dark Souls and try to capture the fairness of it. A lot of the designs of the enemies means that sometimes it can be a little unclear as to their attack patterns and whether or not they're telegraphing an attack, that sort of thing, which can obviously means that you take more damage than you really should be if obviously the enemy attacks were probably telegraphed, because obviously the main crux of Dark Souls is, you know, if you're good enough you can just go through the game without being hit. You know, people have done it, they're all insane, but they've done it, it is possible. And obviously you've got your shield as well, but that still requires knowing when to raise your shield and use that stamina, that sort of thing. So obviously having unclear enemy patterns might not sound like a big thing, but it is when we're talking about Dark Souls games. But this has very much been described as Sci-Fi Souls, and until we get a proper Sci-Fi Souls, which I really, really hope From Software will do, just saying, this is definitely a good one. It has its share of warts, share of flaws, but it has enough soul and enough uniqueness about it, and enough of what makes Dark Souls good to be at least worth an add to your wish list, because it is fairly expensive. It only came out back in May, so obviously the reduction isn't massive, and this is a full price title as well. So it's 25% off, making it $29.99. So I would say add this to your wish list for the future, because it's definitely worth a look-see. Our next title, however, is much, much cheaper, and it is Titan Souls. This game actually takes inspiration from two of my favourite games, that being Dark Souls, and the other one being Shadow of the Colossus. It definitely reminds me of Shadow of the Colossus, because all the enemies that you fight are the bosses that you fight. Very similar to Shadow of the Colossus, where it was a very empty world and the only life you saw, apart from the occasional lizard, was of course these massive beings that you had to kill. No colossi here, unfortunately, but we do have a nice variety of weird and wonderful enemies, as well as a very interesting style of gameplay. It's not strictly a Dark Souls-like in terms of the way that, you know, Salt and Sanctuary is or Dead Cells is, but I still think it has enough influences here and enough things that are similar to that series to be worth a look to those who like the Dark Souls series. You only have a single arrow with which to fire, and once you've fired that arrow you have to go and get it back. And this game is very much about finding the boss's weak point and hitting it with your arrow. And it is very sort of, you know, rinse, repeat, die, try again, repeat. Very sort of quick fire, reconnaissance runs, that sort of thing, because you die pretty much in one hit. But, you know, once you've found the weak spot for the boss, then so will they. So it is very, very challenging and very based upon your sort of reflexes and knowing the patterns and figuring out, okay, how do I get the weak spot, because you might know what it is, but how do I get it, you know, what's my opening to actually attack it, that sort of thing. It definitely has that element of Dark Souls where you're thinking, okay, here's the guy's attack patterns, here are my openings to attack, here's how I'm going to retrieve my arrow, that sort of thing. So that's why I think this is 100% worth a go. We're almost to the home stretch, but before we get to our final entry, we have one more in the form of Necropolis. The first thing you'll probably notice about this game is that it obviously has a very striking aesthetic has low poly count and has some really nice contrasting colours that really give it this unique look that instantly sticks in your mind. It is obviously a sort of dungeon crawler style game, and there are tons of those on Steam, but you know, unique graphics, a unique style that makes the game stand out amongst all the sea of games that are like it is definitely something that is important. And it does feel very similar to Dark Souls in that, you know, you're traversing dungeons, you're finding loot, and you're finding big bosses, and is again a slower and more methodical style of combat, which is definitely going to be for those Dark Souls purists. You know, the purists are going to want that sort of slow, strategic feel, the very plodding combat of Dark Souls. The faster paced ones obviously are not going to be for the more traditional folks. It's going to be Necropolis that are for those guys, you know, Salt and Sanctuary, The Surge, that sort of thing. And I definitely think Necropolis is worth a look-see. I would say it's definitely the most, or one of the most, should I say, interesting looking games in terms of its aesthetic on this list. But obviously, a lot of these games have an interesting aesthetic. I think definitely Dead Cells and Hyperlight Drifter are up there as well. I would say those are the top three in terms of graphics. And I would say the third-person perspective, you know, behind the character is obviously more traditional as well. So yeah, again, this game, where's its Dark Souls influence, where it kind of matters most in its exploration, the boss fights, and of course the combat being, again, that slow and methodical style. And our final offering for today is one that is very clearly inspired by Dark Souls. I mean, the UI, the second you see it, is very clearly Dark Souls inspired with Dark Mouse. Oh, sorry, I just realised I didn't say how much Titan Souls was. It's 75% off, making it £2.74. But, back to Dark Mouse. It is essentially a top-down indie Dark Souls. If you look at it, it has this very interesting brown and black aesthetic. It's very striking, actually, where all the enemies are sort of done in this very sort of dark, bold black. Obviously, you do have some other colours, like there's a bit of yellow in there. Obviously, there's fire as well, so you got that, and a little bit of green, but it is mostly browns and blacks, and the enemies are, you know, all done in these sort of very bold colours, and the UI is very, very Dark Souls. But the similarities go beyond mere UI choice. Obviously, this is very different aesthetically to Dark Souls, but it definitely borrows heavily from that style of gameplay, very deliberate, choosing your moves, that sort of thing. But obviously, the top-down perspective gives you some new possibilities that wouldn't be an option in the traditional Dark Souls world. Obviously, when you're rolling in a top-down perspective, you might be able to, say, choose your direction of roll a bit more strategically. You're going to have less instances of rolling off an edge and dying instantly, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So while the aesthetic might not be for everyone with Dark Mouse, this love letter to Dark Souls is definitely worth a look-see, especially at the 66% off price of £2.37. So, there you have it. 7 games that are like Dark Souls in the Steam sale this summer. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.